The dense storm clouds blanketing the sky over Fairmont Crest seemed as if they were only heralding a night shower, but in truth they were the perfectly timed curtain to conceal the fractures quietly spreading through the house where Jacob and Naomi had tried to stitch happiness back together with fragile seams after so many trials. When Naomi dropped the bomb about the child, the space around them slid off its normal axis, and Jacob, the man who believed he had learned to stand up after every fall, suddenly discovered his body would no longer obey him. He stood there as if time had stopped while memory sprinted backward for miles. Back to the nights the two of them lay silent in a room steeped in the smell of antiseptic, back to ultrasound images without a heartbeat, back to dreams of emptiness where a tiny hand had never had the chance to grasp before slipping away. This time, when fate returned the chance at fatherhood, the thing that came between them was not blind destiny but a fear that had shape and name and ambition. Naomi stood on the threshold of a chapter in her life rebuilt by self-rescue, where every invitation, every meeting, every spotlight was proof she had escaped the shadows of the past. On that survival map, a child appeared like a terrifying variable capable of wrecking the calculations, and the cruelest part was that the variable came from the love she kept reassuring herself still remained. When Naomi said she wasn't ready and the silence fell like a heavy curtain, Jacob understood that the coming battle was not merely about a choice. It was a siege on faith itself, where his longing to be a father would be tested by the boundaries of her body and her fierce need for freedom. He wanted to believe her words about bodily autonomy were the product of temporary panic, that a day or a week later, reason and love would meet at a common point. But as night followed night and Naomi stood before the mirror whispering a cold survival mantra to herself, Jacob began to hear unfamiliar sounds inside his chest, the stirrings of another self, one willing to do things he had always believed were unacceptable. Fairmont Crest never stands still before anyone's private tragedy. In a place where reputations are cast from lavish galas and donation checks, personal vulnerability is always at risk of being forged into a weapon. Since Naomi had risen through the local arts council and started steering the Fairmont Community Fund's campaigns, many eyes had lingered on her, not to applaud but to await the first misstep. Whispered tales of an old relationship that might still cling, of a medical failure she once endured, or of a city doctor who knew too much and kept too quiet, started to take shape like raindrops defining the coming storm. Naomi understood that a single anonymous text slipping from an unmarked clinic could topple the scaffolding of her career like a tower built on misaligned footings. And so the survival map she drew was inked with decisions so cool they verged on cruel. And few could imagine the price a woman must pay when forced to weigh her own body against a hard-won place in the world. Jacob began outlining a nameless plan, hovering at the border between love and control, between protection and intrusion. He told himself that all he wanted was the truth, only a chance to persuade, only not to be erased from the story of his own life. Those harmless onlys, stacked high, can turn anyone into a defense attorney for the unethical. So, on a rainy night when the street lamps stretched into smears on the windshield, Jacob pulled up at a clinic in the outskirts, where appointments often bore no names and records were coded into emotionless strings. He sought out a doctor who had once been a classmate of a distant cousin, through a bland introduction, and laid out arguments that sounded compassion-rich on their surface, that he did not want to seize control of the decision, only to ensure Naomi wouldn't act in panic, that some things needed double-checking, that if someone could speak to her as an independent specialist, perhaps the outcome might change. As those arguments slipped and coiled, Jacob knew he had already stepped off the ethical line, because every indirect intervention is but a softer name for wresting away another's autonomy. But the fear of losing another child, the fear of fragile happiness being crushed, the fear of seeing Naomi slam all doors closed, tightened his muscles like ropes drawing his mind to a single option: cling no matter the cost. Meanwhile, Naomi arranged everything as though assembling an emergency file, each quiet step wrapped in discretion. She postponed a few evening meetings, blended personal and professional schedules to conceal an early appointment at a clinic, She told herself this was the most rational choice for now, that the present pang would hurt less than the ruin of an entire life, that if she paused long enough to hear the tender thrum of a desire to mother rising from deep inside, she would not be strong enough to do what had to be done. But the hours waiting for nightfall were like an internal interrogation without an inquisitor, where every verdict was overturned by her own conscience. Whenever she pictured Jacob's face brightening with hope, a part of her softened, only to be yanked back by the scene of a career collapsing, social media howling, benefactors turning away, and quiet enemies on the council applauding with delight. And so Naomi lived in two parallel worlds, the guardian of her own future and the thief of the dream of the man who had helped her sweep the shattered pieces after the last storm. The tremor could not remain confined to two people. Danny, with the instincts of someone scarred on the rungs of power and who had seen far too many catastrophes born from divided choices, quickly sensed the misalignment in that seemingly quiet house. She believed Naomi was heading toward an unforgivable mistake, not out of sanctimony or judgment, but because she understood that Fairmont Crest rewards those who endure and punishes mercilessly those who flee mid-battle. To Danny, the child was not only blood, but also an anchor to keep the family's boat from capsizing in a rising tide of power. Nicole, however, viewed matters through the eyes of a woman who knew too well what it felt like to be stared at by an entire town eager to pierce every private wall. In Naomi, she saw a heart in spasm and a mind in terror, a person forced into a corner by the roar of an invisible crowd. Nicole believed no one had the right to seize Naomi's body and future to satisfy their own idea of family. Thus, the couple's private crisis spread to the kitchen, the staircase, the boardroom, spilling into dinners and event schedules like an oil slick, slow but stubborn, forcing everyone to choose sides even if none would admit it. Escalation came sooner than expected when an unlabeled medical note leaked into the anonymous inbox of a touchy donor who insists on draping moral conditions over every dollar he gives to curate his image. Within 24 hours, the story of an as-yet unmade medical decision had curdled into filthy speculation about a scheme to manipulate emotions, then hardened into accusations that Naomi was keeping Jacob on a hook of hope to exchange for his family's support in a pending grant announcement. No one knew where the first thread had come from. They only knew that Fairmont Crest never misses a chance to tear at a bleeding wound. Jacob went numb as he read the slop of words, not because he had seeded the rumor, but because he knew he had already entered a fog where boundaries blur, and a single cruel coincidence could twist his hidden intentions into evidence of guilt. Naomi sank like a stone thrown into a lake, stripped bare in the public square, ashamed and furious, and above all terrified that the narrative of her own life had slipped out of her hands. In the torrent, every glance from Danny turned blade sharp. Every reassurance from Nicole felt like a sliding door closing off the world so she could breathe. Caught between those pulls, Naomi shrank inward, clinging to her original decision like a shipwrecked soul to the last plank. Jacob nearly lost control when the thought flashed that he could file for a protective order, request a hold on medical information to delay any procedure for a time. The idea sliced across the night like a bolt of lightning, illuminating his face for an instant, a face he himself did not wish to see, lined with possessiveness and desperation. He knew he could do it. He knew the moves, had the name and network to churn up a procedural fog, only enough to buy a few weeks for hope and gentle words to take hold. But he also knew that such a coercive move would sever any path back, transforming love into chains. He sat in the car for a long time, gripping the wheel until his knuckles whitened, and only released when thunder cracked in the distance, jolting him back into the shame of the figure lurking within. A man ready to bend the world in love's name. Naomi, meanwhile, walked into the clinic with a heart heavy as lead. The corridor art, sapling forests and tranquil beaches, felt like mockery. She filled out forms with trembling hands, and the fragile image of the child that never was flickered in her mind like a thin shaft of light. She wondered if that loss was making her panic more than necessary, if she was punishing herself for not holding on the first time, or punishing Jacob for believing everything could be healed by the dream of fatherhood. In the brief moment before the consultation door opened, Naomi pressed her palm to her belly, not to hold on, but to memorize the sensation once, like someone resting a hand on the wall of an old house before selling it. She thought of Danny's gaze, a mix of judgment and worry, of Nicole's quiet sheltering, of donors lying in wait for a misstep, of the council listening for a sigh, and of Jacob, who might forgive if she was honest or become an enemy if she lied. She accepted that whatever she chose would leave scars, and the only thing she could still keep was ownership of the final decision. Cruel as it might be, word of the appointment reached Jacob faster than he expected through the invisible chain this city always provides. He drove into a rain thick as syrup, each turn a question about honor, freedom, and love with no answer that sounded clean. He vowed he would not beg, would not force, would not do anything that made Naomi feel more trapped. He only wanted to be there as proof that he would not flee the hardest moment. But when he parked in the back lot and approached the frosted glass door, his steps slowed. Inside was cold white light, the clack of heels on tile, stacks of forms. Outside stood a man who knew too well that every step forward could be read as trespass. He stood there, drenched, suspended between two opposing impulses. Save the chance at fatherhood and spare the woman he loves from feeling coerced. The conflict buckled his knees right there on the threshold at the same time. In another wing of Fairmont Crest, Danny and Nicole faced each other in silence. Danny knew that if Naomi crossed that threshold, the family would suffer fissures not easily mended, because Jacob would not be the same Jacob. Nicole knew that if Naomi were pulled back by collective pressure, Fairmont Crest would score yet another victory in its war on personal freedom. They could neither bind nor save one another. Each clutched a private fear like opposite poles of a magnet holding the house upright for now. Then a text from a clinic acquaintance flared on Nicole's phone. A single line saying Naomi had entered counseling and Jacob was standing outside in the rain. Nicole closed her eyes, aware that any advice now would only worsen things. She set the phone down and kept quiet the way one lays a white flower on a whirlpool. The storm outside began to shift, but the storm within them only gathered force. In the waiting room, an administrative announcement chimed just as Jacob reached for the door handle. In the consultation room, Naomi listened to the neutral phrases all doctors are trained to use, words designed to keep a patient from tumbling off a cliff, and amid that steady cadence she suddenly heard her own pulse like a drumbeat of alarm. No one knows what she decided in that instant, because the emotional door closed to the world, and all that remained were heavy breaths. But from that moment, consequences started to slide like slabs of earth shearing from a hillside after rain, no matter whether she turned left or right. When Naomi stepped out, the world would not be the same, and Jacob, whether he was standing there or not, would have to learn to see the woman before him without the lens of what he believed to be salvation. Fairmont Crest would continue to buzz. Donors would whisper. The council would hedge. Danny would tighten the fences of discipline to keep the family from collapse. Nicole would have to shoulder the press like a wall that is soft yet firm. And in the middle of it all, Naomi and Jacob would pin each other with the gaze of two people who had just lost something that had no name. If Naomi had changed their timeline forever, she would carry the shadow of that choice until another light strong enough arrived to soften it, or until she no longer had the strength to hold her own hand and stand. If she had not changed anything tonight, the fact that she had come to the cliff's edge would still push them a little farther apart, because Jacob would never forget the feeling of standing in the rain, watching his world tremble behind a pane of frosted glass in a place like Fairmont Crest. There are no tidy endings to battles like this, only pauses where people catch their breath before being swept again into the gyre of power and self-defense. The questions of forgiveness, of turning love into enmity or the reverse, will not be answered by a single conversation, a single apology, or a single gesture of goodwill. The only certainty is that each person has lost a piece of themselves along the way. Naomi trades peace for sovereignty over her body. Jacob trades ethics for the preservation of hope. Danny trades tenderness for structure. Nicole trades safety for compassion. And the sky over Fairmont Crest, after the rain, will clear in a counterfeit way, as if nothing had happened. Yet in the seams of roof tiles, beneath the foundations where rainwater still seeps, the cracks have been seeded. On a day not far off, when another weight descends, they will gape. And then no one will know whether this family house still has the pillars to remain standing. The only thing they know right now is that the aftermath has begun and time will show mercy to no one, nor rewind even a minute to let them change their minds.